Alright, so the next Poe and Price collaboration we're going to talk about is still Corman. This is actually the last Corman as far as his lineup, but we're not quite done in this series talking about Corman just yet, because we've got the poems in another video. But going into this one, which is probably one of the most beloved, if not the most beloved, of the Poe adaptations, at least in this area with Price and Corman. And as far as the story of Ligeia, it's one that I feel like is kind of off the radar if you're not familiar with this movie. At least that's kind of the vibe I've gotten. It's another one that's got, like, when we talked about with House of Usher, how Poe's stories can be so short, but also have so much in them and contain so much. And this one has so much going on, where it's obviously, like, any of the stories that Poe does about, like, lost loves are gonna stand out. He's got these unrivaled descriptions of, like, longing and sorrow, and this way of, like, combining, like, the fondness, but also the suffering that comes with it. Most of the story is descriptions, very, very in-depth descriptions of Ligeia like that. And a lot of it also is focused on, like, her really ambiguous eyes. That's something that's just really pure Poe, but also going into the idea of memories, basically analyzing the whole science of memories when he's approaching it as, like, these are memories from an ancient time. It's like we're listening to somebody dying, and these are, like, their last sort of resurfaced memories. And he talks about how you can't remember something, but it's, like, always on the verge, like it's in there somewhere, and he goes into that whole thing. And then there's we talk about how common the fear of death aspect is in his work. In the story, he talks about that Glanville passage. That kind of brings that fear of death into it, talking about that concept of, like, us having this sort of hidden strength in us to will death away, and that whole idea. And the placing in of the Conqueror Worm in this story, which makes perfect sense in context, where it's, like, it's a poem about, like, you know, surrendering to death. And it's like, when you think about what the Conqueror Worm is as a story, it's like, it's basically the Macbeth line, the life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. There's even, like, a really, really similar line in the Conqueror Worm with out out are the lights, or it's basically out out brief candle from that same speech in Macbeth. So, taking all these elements and putting it into this very short story, and putting all of this emotion into it, because you could say, I know some people think that a lot of the Poe stories about, like, a lost love are quite similar, but it's like, when you really look at just how much is delved into in each one, they go in many different directions, but all kind of come back to the same emotional foundation. I think that's really the great appeal of them. And so, talking about the movie, which is, there's a lot of differences. The thing about it is, it was adapted by Robert Towne, who's best known, obviously, for writing Chinatown. But here, and he did some other Corman stuff, like Creature from the Haunted Sea and stuff like that. But here, you can really see kind of a writer's brain at work, because he could have just tried to adapt Ligeia as is. But the fact that he sort of took all these different Poe elements, we talked about that with, like, The Pit and the Pendulum, where you can see that in a lot of Poe adaptations. But here it was, like, especially intentional, I think, where he brought in, like, hypnotism and, like, the mesmerism, like we talked about with The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Voldemort, when we were talking about Tales of Terror earlier. And, of course, you know, the intimate connection with a dead loved one is often in these stories. And the whole addition of a black cat. So much of an addition that it's like the poster. So, and bringing all these different Poe elements into it does feel like it's just this culmination of a love of Poe in general, is this story come to life. Not to mention that it's shot by Arthur Grant, who was often known for shooting, like, Hammer movies. And it's like, we already kind of saw in the earlier movies that there's certainly Hammer vibes in all these ones we've talked about, but it is it's in this one especially, and it really makes sense when you know that it was kind of shot through the same eye and the same lens as Hammer movies often were, and so bringing that element is always going to be extremely appealing. There's nothing like the Hammer feeling when you think of, like, classic horror, so combining that with Corman's vision, and then, the Poe and Price angle, this is just a very magical combination of things going on. Not to mention the incredible sets and the countryside setting, making everything look massive, and then seeing on the inside in the Abbey, everything looks so old and haunted. Really, it kind of is haunted in a sense. And so, how I talked about how most of the story is just like the description of Ligeia while she's alive, and then kind of her deterioration, and then Rowena comes into it pretty late. Here, we are starting with Ligeia's burial, in this very sort of somber opening, but also, like, I find it interesting how somber this opening is, but how brightly colored it is. It feels like there's a lot of white, and then there's just, like, the black of Price, and, like, what he's wearing, and the hat and the glasses and everything. And the way he describes that look is, like, I live at night now. It's, like, really sinister, but also tragic when we kind of know what's going on here. But then as we learn later what all he's under exactly, everything's just sort of taking on other meanings as it goes. And in this burial scene, we have this pretty effective jump scare, which is something that you don't typically associate with classic horror. There's definitely a lot of classic horror movies that have jump scares in them, even from this era, but they were like very few, very far between. And so this one is an effective one to kind of introduce the cat into the story. And that's that same moment, that very memorable moment where Ligeia's eyes open. Then, I guess the idea of... I don't feel like it's explicitly stated that Ligeia is kind of living through the cat. And so, like I said, the idea of a black cat antagonizing our lead players is definitely another pretty explicit Poe callback. When you look at Price, in particular, playing this character that we know is otherwise a tragic figure, and giving him this sort of unpredictable quality, and where it's like we're not sure like when he's going to be angry or when he's going to be sympathetic or what he's going to do in one situation versus another or how he's going to react. And then we get scenes like when he sees Rowena and seemingly mistakes her for Ligeia and kind of lunges at her like he's about to choke her. But what's interesting about this scene and the way it plays out is it's like he appears to be attacking her, and that's the way she takes it. But it's also like, is he attacking her? Is he like looking really intensely into her eyes to see if he can see Ligeia's really famous eyes? Is it like a way of defending himself? Like it seems like there's fear in it a little bit. And it's like it just really makes him this unpredictable character, and how we're not quite sure for a long time why he reacts to things the way he does, or actions that he does can seem kind of out of left field. But it makes the character really interesting and really engaging to watch, especially through Price, even though I guess it was a whole thing in the production that they thought Price was way too old, and I get it, but it's the combination of him with Poe and Corman and stuff like that is what we're here for. It's the whole basis of this series we're doing, and it's still fantastic regardless, I think. But I also love the moments when he's talking to Rowena later, and there's a really precisely shot moment when we're looking at them through this old gate, almost like they're being watched, like the way they're framed in it, and there's something like voyeuristic in that sense. I really love that kind of stuff, and it gives, just like his actions can kind of give clues to the hypnosis going on, where like he does things without knowing, like when he attacks her, he says he doesn't know that he did that or remember that he did that. There's the carving into the tombstone that he claims to know that he did, but also doesn't remember. And so when you take those in, and it's like that concept of being watched and not knowing the things that he does, it's all unpredictable in the moment, but it's all adding up to what our eventual climax is, which is great. And also just throwing in these little odd moments that are like the line, "Not 10 minutes ago I tried to kill a stray cat with a cabbage." It's the start of a thought, and he has a point where he's going, but just that sentence kind of at the start, and just the suddenness of it has like this quirky quality to it, this just interesting tone to throw in. And I think the casting of Price is especially great because he just has that voice where there are moments where it's like, where he's sort of like narrating what's going on, or there's something happening over his voice, like this sequence where Rowena's going up and she's chasing the cat up the tower, And just his voice over that, there's something so perfect about it, especially now that we're kind of getting... You'll notice that this story kind of has a bit in common with Vertigo, and to my understanding there was, like, Vertigo influence, like there was Ligeia influence in Vertigo, and then Vertigo influence in this, and you can totally see that, especially in this tower with the bell and stuff like that. Not to mention, on the Hitchcock vein, there's also just a whole lot of Rebecca vibes with the new wife coming in, but the old one still lingering. And it's like, you get the sense that Rebecca's original novel had to have some sort of Ligeia inspiration in it when it was being written. So... and while we're on the topic of Rowena, to talk about Elizabeth Shepard, who is pretty incredible in this. She's probably like the most well-rounded performance by an actress in this sort of Poe lineup. And we get these, like, there's a lot of, like, small moments here, and it's like seeing her as the loving wife that's, you know, attracted to him, but also is succumbing to the terror of everything around her. Like the paranoia that builds when she's under the impression now that Ligeia is alive and essentially gaslighting her. It starts to feel a lot like Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte a little bit. There's also, like, the physical moments when Ligeia is channeled through Rowena and her face and posture completely change. And it's like, every time we see her as Rowena, and then every time we see her as Ligeia, it does feel like two totally different characters. Like, my brain still kind of doesn't compute that it's the same actress, which is pretty incredible. It's amazing, like, what difference the hair color makes, but I think it's more than that. Where, like I said, whether it be the expression or just even the posture or whatever, there's something really special that she's doing here that really creates two very different characters. And, of course, on the topic of their relationship, the Ligeia-Rowena thing going on, it wouldn't be a Corman Poe movie without a trippy dream sequence with a lot of terror in it. And I love the way they took that detail of the raven black hair of Ligeia, because even though we've seen Ligeia's face at this point, I love the way this dream sequence plays out, where they're kind of she's embraced Price, and then Price sort of turns into Ligeia, but the only thing we see is the raven black hair. And it's like, and there's just such a terror about that. Like, what we're seeing and her reaction to it is really great. As far as more imagery that kind of feels like it comes from the story that really stands out is something that seems to be pretty much omitted here, and I totally get why, is that mysterious ruby red liquid that he may or may not hallucinate that ultimately seems to lead to Rowena's death. While we don't have that specifically that I remember, we do have, like, the blood droplet imagery coming from, like, the fox, and then later when Rowena cuts her hand on the mirror and it's dripping off of her fingers. And it's like, I get the idea that that's sort of a callback to that image that we have, that very vivid image we get from the story of the ruby red liquid coming out of the bottle. So I love the addition of that. And obviously this just leads us to this really wild climax where we do get the back and forth of finding out what happened to Ligeia's body, and then them kind of going back and forth where it's like, is she Ligeia, is she Rowena, and this head-spinning thing that Price is going through. And I love the idea of Town approaching this with the intention of approaching it with the combination of being grounded but also being supernatural, and them kind of starting to blend together, and that really comes together in this climax especially. I also like... Honestly, I do like that Rowena ends up getting out. I feel like she deserved that as a character, because I love a dark and twisted ending as much as anybody, and I can see where it probably would have been effective for it to kind of end on the note of when he's strangling Ligeia, and then Kenner comes in and says, you know, that's Rowena, and it's revealed. But I like the fact, even though that's great, that's a great reveal, I don't know, a part of me just likes the fact that we end on that Price and Ligeia end up together forever, tragically, and Rowena is able to get out. I like the way that comes together, and I feel like every character sort of gets what they deserve. And I understand it could seem maybe a bit Hollywoodized to go with more of an upbeat ending, but that's what we've been getting quite a bit throughout this series anyway, and I feel like it still works. And it still shows that if there's one common theme throughout this series, it's that Poe's one of those authors that you don't have to stick to word for word to make a really great and loving adaptation of the work, and I feel like this is a great example of that and shows why this movie in particular is one of the most beloved when it comes to Poe adaptations. So I think we can probably end this one here. We've got one more adaptation of a short story, and then we'll have one video that has adaptations of 3 of the poems. And once again, we're using the word adaptation very loosely for a couple of those, but we'll get to that soon enough, on top of all the other stuff that we're looking at this month. So until the next thing, I think that's it.